Medieval execution was a horrifying and gruesome prospect. During the Middle Ages, the unspeakable cruelty of capital punishment was only matched by the creativity of the torture techniques. To put things into perspective, decapitation was seen as the least painful way to go. The medieval period spanned about 1,000 years between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. During that time, the torture methods used were nothing short of inhumane. Medieval executions ranged from boiling a person alive to crushing someone's head with an elephant. These brutal methods were meant to deter criminals, but they were not always successful. After all, people still committed crimes and suffered dire consequences. Join me as I dive into the dark side of history and try to learn about 10 medieval execution methods that are so gruesome, they just might give me nightmares. In medieval England, one of the most serious crimes was high treason. Since the punishment had to fit the crime, the medieval execution method of being hanged, drawn, and quartered combined several forms of torture. Usually, being drawn simply meant that the person was pulled by a horse to his final destination. However, sometimes this word took on a far grislier meaning when it referred to drawing the person's intestines out of his body later on in the process. As for being hanged, that step is self-explanatory. But in many cases, the person didn't die from the hanging itself. Instead, executioners would hang the victim until he was on the edge of death and then release him so he would still be alive for the real horror, the quartering. This began with castrating the prisoner, throwing his genitals, and sometimes his intestines, into a fire. The prisoner was then decapitated. Finally, as the word quartering implied, the body would be chopped into at least 4 pieces and chucked into a boiling concoction of spices. This prevented birds from picking at the remains and allowed for the body parts to be publicly displayed across the country as a grisly warning. Though typically thought of as just a British punishment, this execution method was actually practiced throughout Europe. The most famous victim of this fate was William Wallace, since his fight to secure Scottish freedom from the English in the 1290s was inherently treasonous. Depicted in the 1995 film Braveheart, Wallace's execution was even more brutal in real life. In Wallace's case, he was drawn by 4 different horses that were each tied to one of his limbs. This was usually done to prisoners the king despised most. After the execution, Wallace's remains were famously scattered around England as a warning to other potential traitors. Shockingly, this practice was used for about 500 years after Wallace's infamous execution, until it was finally outlawed in 1803. For millennia, elephants have been wrangled and trained by humans to accomplish all sorts of things. From assisting armies to helping people cross mountains, elephants have been reliably commandeered to great effect. These colossal creatures even helped construct the legendary Cambodian temple complex, Angkor Wat, in the 12th century. While elephants are revered in Buddhist and Hindu faiths to this day, their specific use as medieval executioners remains lesser known. Although capital punishment in the Middle Ages was unilaterally cruel, death by elephant almost seems too gruesome to be real. Most commonly used in Southeast Asia, death by elephant was known as Gunga Rao in India. Standardized in the Middle Ages, this medieval execution method occasionally found its way to the Western world and only saw a decline in popularity in the 19th century. Typically, death by elephant was relegated to enemy soldiers or civilians who committed crimes like tax evasion and theft. As one might expect, these executions relied on the brute force of an elephant to crush a victim, usually by pressing on their head or abdomen with a foot. However, sometimes executioners came up with more creative approaches. For example, one Delhi sultanate turned the deaths of prisoners into a public spectacle where elephants were trained to cut people open with pointed blades fitted to their tusks. Unlike tigers and lions, elephants aren't naturally inclined to kill human beings, but they can be trained to do so. And perhaps even more chillingly, they can be trained to torture people in specific ways before killing them. For example, the elephant might break a criminal's limbs before doling out a fatal blow to the skull. This was often used to demonstrate a ruler's control. This medieval execution method wasn't exclusive to the Middle Ages and was practiced for centuries in many countries, including India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Death by elephant continued until the late 19th century, when the practice apparently came to an end. Boiling someone to death was an unspeakably agonizing endeavor. Though the Roman Emperor Nero reportedly killed thousands of Christians with this method long before the Middle Ages, it would also become a popular way of punishing coin forgers, especially in the Holy Roman Empire. Later on in Britain, King Henry VIII introduced the practice of boiling to death as a way to execute people who used poison to commit murder. As one might expect, people sentenced to this punishment were simply placed in a large container of heated liquid, which might be water, oil, wax, or even molten lead, and then they basically got cooked. The sensation of being boiled alive was an absolutely horrific one. The method could be made even worse if the water had yet to reach boiling temperatures by the time the person was submerged. Oftentimes, the limbs and extremities were the first things to burn. After the person's outer layers began to cook, their organs began to cook as well. The fluids rose in temperature until they were also boiling. All who went through this medieval execution could only pray for a fast and merciful death. But boiling to death was unfortunately a very slow process. A quick death would only come if the liquid was already boiling when the victim was dunked in. They might also be able to speed up the process if they ducked their head underneath the liquid to boil their brain. But otherwise, it was long and torturous until the very end. Boiling to death was undoubtedly one of the worst possible ways to die in the Middle Ages. Since the victim would probably remain conscious, he'd notice his eyes burning, clothes fusing with his body, and skin blistering. While this should have been reserved for only the worst offenders, it soon became the go-to execution method for forgers of all people. In both France and Germany from the 13th to the 16th century, illegal coining was such an egregious crime that anyone caught producing new coins from melted fragments would die via boiling. It was only when authorities realized they could mint coins with milled edges, and thus make it clear if a coin was fake, that this practice finally started to come to an end. There was perhaps no greater proponent of impalement than Vlad the Impaler, who reigned over Wallachia, present-day Romania, in the 1400s. He was so adamant about skewering his enemies that his bloodlust later inspired the legendary character Count Dracula. As for the process itself, impalement was a macabre and prolonged torture that preceded an inevitable death. Traditionally, a stake would be partially sharpened and then planted in the ground with the point facing upward. The victim would then be placed over the spike. They would then be skewered through the rectum if they were a man, or the vagina if they were a woman. The semi-greased stake would forcibly penetrate the victim's insides until the person eventually died, and the stake would often exit near their neck, throat, or shoulders. Some of these poles were purposefully blunted to prolong the torture, with some cases of impalement going on for hours or even days. While Vlad the Impaler was often praised for his military exploits and for bringing order to Wallachia, he was also undeniably cruel. In 1459, he had dozens of Saxon merchants impaled in Kronstadt. That same year, he nailed the hats of diplomats to their skulls after they refused to remove them out of religious devotion. In total, Vlad the Impaler is estimated to have slaughtered 80,000 people in various ways. Around 20,000 of them were impaled and put on display outside the city of Targovist. The sight was so terrifying that the invading Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II immediately turned around after seeing it. Some envision impalement as a victim being skewered through the torso, which is a common misconception. While transverse impalement certainly existed and proved to be a far more efficient death, that was typically not the intention. Generally, impalement was meant to be a long, torturous punishment and a warning to enemies to not mess with the person who was responsible for it. After all, Mem too wasn't the only one who was terrified at the sight of thousands of impaled people. Any invading army would surely have its bravery tested while witnessing something like that. Interestingly enough, the earliest records of this type of torture come from 1772 BC in Babylon, where King Hammurabi ordered a woman to be executed in this way for killing her husband. But the use of this largely medieval execution method continued until as recently as the 20th century, when the Ottoman government employed it during the Armenian genocide. Gibbeting was the practice of locking criminals in human-shaped cages and hanging them up for display in public areas as a warning to others. The gibbet itself refers to the wooden structure from which the cage was hung. In some cases, people were already executed prior to being gibbeted. But in other cases, they were still alive and left to die of exposure and starvation. Immobile and ghastly while alive, and reeking once dead, people who were gibbeted were haunting to behold. The medieval origin of gibbeting is often overlooked due to the popularity of the punishment in 1740s Britain. Nonetheless, many people before then were sentenced to die by being trapped in this torturous contraption. Leaders of Germany's Anabaptist movement in Munster were gibbeted in 1536, and the steel cages are still on display to this day. The United Kingdom also has gibbets on display, and one even contains parts of a skull. Officials ensured that no one removed the contraption by hanging it up about 30 feet in the air, so the body of a gibbeted prisoner could remain in the cage for years, creaking in the wind. And birds and bugs would pick at the corpses as they turned into skeletons. Women were spared from the gibbets, but not out of gentlemanly deferment. Rather, women's bodies were hot property for surgeons and anatomists. Gibbeting fell out of fashion by 1832. But between 1752 and 1832, 134 men were hanged in chains, until it was finally declared illegal in 1834. The British may not have been known for crushing people with elephants, but they did crush people using weights, like large stones and other heavy items. Disturbingly, people who were sentenced to crushing hadn't even been found guilty of anything. Instead, this pressing was supposed to coerce them into entering a plea. Crushing was one of many medieval execution methods that were initially intended to coerce confessions out of alleged criminals. It was reserved for those who refused to plead guilty or not guilty to a crime. However, this approach commonly led to the victim dying. England's crushing method, which dates back to the 13th century, continued well into the Enlightenment era. Weight was slowly stacked on top of these victims until they suffocated. Sometimes their bones would break during the process and burst through their skin. Margaret Clitheroe was famously crushed to death for refusing to enter a guilty plea against charges that she practiced Catholicism and harbored priests. In 1586, she was stripped naked in public and dragged to a bridge to forcibly enter a plea. She never did, and so her limbs were tied with ropes and stretched out, and a door was placed on top of her. About 800 pounds of stones were placed on top of her until her spine snapped and her ribs burst from her skin. Her steadfast disposition and tragic death led to her being named a saint by the Catholic Church in 1970. But perhaps the most famous crushing occurred after the Middle Ages, during the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts. In 1692, mass hysteria had set in at the village, and an estimated 200 people were accused of witchcraft. The panic was so heightened that a special court was formed to hear the cases, which resulted in 20 executions. Giles Corey. His refusal to stand trial resulted in authorities ordering a crushing, in the hopes that he would at least enter a plea. Stripped naked with a board placed on his chest, Corey was aware of how this would end. He could plead innocent and be executed for being a witch, or stay strong and die with his dignity intact, and also allow his living relatives to keep his land. Throughout the crushing, the farmer did nothing but ask for more weight to be added so that death would come quickly. His body endured for about 2 days before giving out. England finally outlawed this revolting practice in 1772. The ancient Greeks and Romans believed that beheading was an honorable death sentence. This was also a common belief during the Middle Ages, especially since beheading was viewed as a more humane form of capital punishment than the alternatives. Unfortunately for some of the earliest victims, the execution method usually involved an axe. It was only later that more efficient swords were used, and victims were typically granted a relatively speedy death. When compared to other medieval execution methods, it's clear that beheading was one of the least painful, and so it was considered the most honorable way to die. That's why beheadings were typically reserved for nobles, knights, and other royalty. According to tradition, beheading by sword was introduced to England by William the Conqueror during the 11th century. The victim was often instructed to stand or kneel upright, since a block could have impeded the downward stroke of the sword. Of course, beheading did not stop when the Middle Ages ended. In 1587, after 19 years of imprisonment, Mary, Queen of Scots, was so grateful for her beheading that she told her own executioner, "I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." Meanwhile, King Henry VIII was so adamant about Anne Boleyn's decapitation in 1536 that he sent for an expert swordsman from France to do the deed. On the day of her execution, Boleyn reportedly exclaimed, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." Margaret Pole, meanwhile, wasn't as lucky in 1541. Though members of high society were commonly granted the sword-based beheading, the Countess of Salisbury was beheaded with an axe, and the executioner was reportedly a blundering youth who hacked her head and shoulders to pieces. Those in power during the Middle Ages generally attempted to match the severity of capital punishment with the associated crime. Unfortunately, both sexism and superstition were alive and well in medieval times. The ramifications of this deadly combination resulted in women being accused of witchcraft or heresy and subsequently burned at the stake. Originally a Babylonian form of capital punishment, burning at the stake was later practiced in Europe during the Middle Ages. From Spanish heretics during the Inquisition to French martyrs like Joan of Arc, the practice of burning people to death became distressingly popular during this time. The punishment was simple. The accused would be bound to a stake and burned until their anguished screams finally ceased. But in some cases, those in charge would provide the victims with a semblance of mercy by attaching a container of gunpowder to the victim. This would explode when heated by the fire, killing the person much quicker. Other mechanisms included placing the victim in a chain noose and killing them by hanging before the fire could do much damage. Shockingly, many accusations of witchcraft during this time didn't actually originate from an authority like the church. In those days, it was common that accusations of heresy or witchcraft came about due to petty rivalries in small towns. Frighteningly, mere finger-pointing could lead to someone being killed by fire if the accusations were supported by others. In England, burning people for heresy fell out of fashion in 1612, but burning at the stake for other crimes continued well into the 18th century. Depending on your particular phobias, immurement might be the most horrifying medieval execution method of all. The seemingly mundane term describes the complete enclosure of a person in a small space with no escape besides death. Immurement was a popular form of capital punishment across various cultures. The practice was typically carried out by locking the victim in some sort of coffin-like box or sealing them into a wall or another structure. In medieval times, the Roman Catholic Church often doled out this punishment to nuns or monks who had broken a vow of chastity or expressed heretical ideas. These victims would be sealed inside rooms with small openings for just food and water. That way, they would have no contact with the outside world as they experienced days, weeks, or even months in isolation until they took their final breath. The earliest uses of immurement date back to the Roman Empire, where it served as punishment for a class of priestesses known as the Vestal Virgins. From respectable families and vowed to celibacy, the The Vestal virgins had promised to honor the goddess of home and family, Vesta. Though the punishment for breaking that sacred vow was death, Vestal bloodshed was religiously and legally forbidden. As such, the alternative punishment of immurement was implemented. A Vestal's executioners would prepare a small vault in the ground, usually containing food and water. The Vestal would be led into the vault, where she would be left to die. While some cases of immurement were just temporary punishments, those who were sentenced to die this way were forced to confront the fact that their only freedom was death. The most notable medieval figure believed to be immured was King Richard II. Known for his arbitrary and factional rule, he died under mysterious circumstances in 1400. It was rumored that he died due to starvation while he was being confined in the Pontefract Castle. In 1409, for Bavarian clerics in Augsburg, Germany were immured in a particularly macabre manner. After they were found guilty of child sexual abuse, the Church of Augsburg sealed each cleric inside a wooden coffin before suspending the coffins inside a tower and leaving the clerics to starve to death in midair. Shockingly, immurement went on much longer than you might think. As recently as 1903, traveler M.E. Hume Griffith said he'd witnessed the punishment while wandering through Persia. He heard men crying out for help as they were sealed up and left to die in stone pillars. One of the more aesthetically recognizable periods of the medieval era was the Viking Age. This period saw Norse warriors descend upon various places in Europe to raid, trade, and settle. It also reportedly saw culturally specific execution methods. Perhaps the most grisly was the blood eagle, which was specifically tailored for revenge and ritual torture. Only two accounts exist of the blood eagle: the Orkney Inga Saga and Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla. These scriptures were penned at least 2 centuries after the first blood eagle ceremonies occurred, with one of the earliest victims believed to have been executed in this way in 867 AD. The first unfortunate subject was the king of Northumbria, Ella. He had allegedly killed Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit of snakes. As a result, Lothbrok's sons invaded England in 865 and saw to it that Aella suffered death by blood eagle. But if it did occur, here's how it went. The victim's hands and legs would be tied to prevent any sudden movements. The executioner would then stab the victim in the tailbone and move up toward the rib cage. Each rib was then carefully separated from the backbone with an axe. With the person's internal organs now on display, Vikings would rub salt onto the gaping wound to keep the person awake. Finally, the executioner would pull the subject's lungs out in order to form 2 bloody wings. The blood eagle has been described as both a ritual execution and a form of vengeance. The former intended to honor Odin, father of the Norse pantheon of gods and the god of war. The latter, meanwhile, aimed to punish dishonorable individuals in the most excruciating manner possible.